In this video, I'm going to go over some stories in a 3-book anthology series about the end of the world. John Joseph Adams, who I think is one of the best anthology editors in the business, put together an interesting 3-book anthology series about the end of the world. What's different about this one is the structure. The first book, which is called The End Is Nigh, has stories about life leading up to the apocalypse. Book 2, The End Is Now, has stories about life during the apocalypse. And the final book, The End Has Come, covers life after the apocalypse. Each author that contributed stories was asked to write a story for each book following that pattern. Not every author was able to do that, but I'll cover 3 of the ones who did in this video: Robin Wasserman, Charlie Jane Anders, and Ken Liu. Robin Wasserman's tales all concern a group that were pulled into a religious cult, which was actually a con job. The first story is called The Balm in the Wound. It's told from the perspective of a con man named Abraham that has created a religious cult called the Children of Abraham. He has also predicted the world would end in 9 months. When a former lover of his appears and leaves Abraham with a 10-year-old that's obviously his son, he has to deal with that while trying to manage his flock at the same time. I really liked this story a lot. It's a criticism of religious con men and cult leaders that dupe people out of their money, lives, and freedom. Abraham's viewpoint also shows some of the contempt that con men have for the sucker that's being fooled by their BS. The story seems to be a take on the Moses and Noah stories in the Bible, with Abraham taking in people that are lost and saying he'll lead them through the end of the world. I also found it humorous that the end of the current world and the birth of the new one was set for 9 months from the story's beginning, since that is the length of a human pregnancy. I'm guessing the author did that on purpose. The characterizations and descriptions in the story were excellent, the pace was perfect, and I enjoyed it a lot. I'd rate it a 9 out of 10. The second story in this story arc is called Dear John. If you don't know, a Dear John letter is a letter that someone in a relationship writes to tell the other person they're leaving the relationship. This story is an epistolary story made up of letters from Heather, a member of Abraham's cult that has survived the onset of the apocalypse. She's addressing the letters to her former male partners. The letters are mostly angry at the way Heather was treated by those male partners. While ranting about their relationship, she works in current things about what is happening with the children of Abraham and its current leader Isaac, who is a 13-year-old boy at this point. Some of the things she doesn't like is the boredom of being in their sanctuary. There's no variety in the food. Isaac is now telling people who they will marry. Exile for those that don't follow Isaac's rules. The line that sums up a lot of the story is never trust anyone who says God has a plan. A sense of dread slowly builds in the story. One of the biggest fears it uses is the fear people have when they're in relationships. Am I good enough? What if I do something wrong? Why did all the others leave me? Will this one leave me? The tension the author manages to keep in the story is impressive too, since it's told through letters, which inherently indicate that the letter writer survived whatever's happening in the story. Again, the pacing and characterization through the lens of Heather's memories was well done. I'd give the story an 8 out of 10. The final story in the arc of the Children of Abraham is titled In the Valley of the Shadow of the Promised Land. This one starts off decades after the apocalypse. The Children of Abraham cult's leader, Isaac, is old. The cult has reestablished a community outside the sanctuary that let them survive the apocalypse. While the community gets ready for Isaac's next birthday, a man named Kyle enters their area and has a photo of someone that looks familiar to Isaac. This story is told mostly from Isaac's perspective. He's an old man that still believes in God. However, he's taken it upon himself to write a new Bible that will be followed. He's getting more forgetful every day, and his lifetime of leadership and worship has kind of turned him into a cynic. He doesn't see much of the good in anything, including his sons Joseph and Thomas. I'm not super familiar with the Bible, but it seems that a couple biblical threads run through this one. I think there's a hint of the prodigal son with Kyle's storyline. There's also Isaac's perception that Joseph and Thomas both want to take over once Isaac is gone, almost like he expects a Cain and Abel situation with one slaying the other. I like the story to a degree, though slightly less than the first two in the 3-story arc. I would still give it a 7 out of 10 and say that the ending felt like a bit of a surprise, but was appropriate given what's known about the characters. So the first Apocalypse arc has individual 9, 8, and 7 ratings. Overall, the entire arc was entertaining and each story was unique in its own way. I'd give the entire arc an 8 out of 10. It's well worth your time to read it. The next story arc is by Charlie Jane Anders and starts with a group of kids that make amateur movies. It starts off with a story called Break, Break, Break. Rock Manning is a high school kid whose dad was a stuntman at one time, so he's got a little daredevil in him and a little crazy in him. He makes very amateur films with his best friend Sally, and their sort of nemesis is a big kid named Ricky Artesian, who's a bit of a bully. There are hints at things that might cause the end of the world in various ways. There's a water shortage, a debt crisis, a war being fought with a country that is supposedly pumping drugs into the United States. It apparently isn't going well since they keep lowering the draft age. All this leads to Rocky, Sally, and Ricky working together on a film. This story has some funny moments in it and some slapstick comedy with Rock seemingly unembarrassed by any physical pratfall. Rock is a fan of old silent films with Buster Keaton, and this turns out to be some foreshadowing for something that happens in the next story of this story arc. The story feels mostly like setup for the stories that follow it. The reader gets some feeling for what kind of person Rock is with some depth, and a little feeling for Sally and Ricky with a bit less depth. I felt like it was an okay story, though I wasn't a big fan of it. I'd rate it a 5 out of 10. The second story is called Rock Manning Can't Hear You. Sally and Rock are a little older now and living in Boston. Sally's in college and Rock's working in a convenience store between filming movies with Sally. When a guy comes in to rob the store, Rock ends up getting to know him a little and invites him to the next movie filming that he and Sally are working on. I think this story suffers a bit from middle book syndrome, like the second book in a trilogy. Some things happen to deepen Rock's concern about people wearing red bandanas who are essentially a militia. These guys are led by Ricky Artesian, Rock's old nemesis from the first story. The event foreshadowed by the Buster Keaton movie connection happens in this story and sets up the apocalyptic world for the next story. However, aside from that, I didn't really like this story much, and I'd rate it a 4 out of 10. The concluding story in this set is called The Last Movie Ever Made. The world is slightly different since the apocalyptic event that the previous story had. The Red Bandana Militia has imposed martial law, and many people aren't happy about it, but they're getting by. One day, Rock sees a message that says, Rock Manning, we need you. He tries to ignore it, but keeps seeing variations of it everywhere he goes, and then finally he's confronted by Ricky Artesian. This story was more like the first story, a little slapstick at times. There's a bigger conflict outlined by what Rock sees and thinks. However, I didn't like this story much. About the best thing I can say about it is that at least I didn't have to read another story like it to finish this story arc. I'd rate this one a 5 out of 10. So the stories in this arc had a 5, a 4, and a 5 rating. I didn't like it much. It was a little too silly, and I never felt the urgency of the apocalypse, either before, during, or after its arrival. It's possible that it was all purely satire of the genre, and I completely missed it, but I'm not all that great with comedy in written form. Overall, I'd rate this one a 4 out of 10 for the whole arc. The final story trilogy I'll cover in this video is by Ken Liu. This one starts with a story called The Gods Will Not Be Chained. Maddie is a young girl who had to move because her mom needed a job. When some girls at her new school start picking on Maddie, a mysterious online presence helps her out. Because of the way it communicates with her, Maddie quickly realizes who the online presence is. Now, I'm not a big fan of stories with children as the protagonist. I was a little concerned this one was going to stay in like a middle grade reader vein. Luckily, I was wrong. Within a couple pages of me thinking that, it took a turn that made it much more interesting to me. There's a theme in the story about prolonging life, whether someone wants it lengthened or not. There's also the question of motivation. Is the group prolonging the life because it's the right thing to do or because it helps some goal they have? If it's the second one, is it right to do that without the person's permission? How does this affect the person whose life has been prolonged? The adult turn in this story made it well worth the time to read, and I couldn't wait to read the rest of this story arc. I'd rate this one an 8 out of 10. Story 2 in this arc is called The Gods Will Not Be Slain. The world events hinted at in the first story are starting to happen. Tensions are rising in Asia that could lead to war. Russia's angry about a cyber attack. India has nationalized all their telecom equipment because of a stock market crash. There are computer research centers and companies that are going out of business, and a new kind of AI is kind of running rampant over networks. Thanks to the online presence that Maddie talks to all the time, she and her mother are prepared for these events. They've been stockpiling supplies and preparing for the major changes that are coming. The online presence tells Maddie about a battle it was recently in with another online presence. When the government requests volunteers, Maddie's mom decides they need to go to Boston, which is where the company that Maddie's dad used to work for is located. This story builds on the last story perfectly. The connections are all laid out well, and there's a little bit of action in this one. The action's off camera, but the concepts involved in the battle are described so well that it was easy to visualize without explicit descriptions of what was actually happening. If you're a fan of The Matrix, you might actually like this story. There's a revenge theme to go alongside the contrasting family love that's embodied in Maddie and her mother as well. I like this story a lot and rate it a 9 out of 10. The Gods Did Not Die in Vain is the final title in this story arc. Maddie has met a new presence online that claims to be her sister. She starts talking to this presence to learn more about it and names it Mist. At the same time, her mother is handling logistics issues related to getting food and clothing to people that need it. It seems that the human population can't become efficient enough to take care of its people without the help of the very computers that brought about the recent apocalypse. Those computers were heavily restricted by law afterward, too. Maddie sees echoes of herself in Mist and also sees parts of Mist that are nothing like herself. There's a theme about knowledge in this story. Basically, is knowing everything about something the same as having direct experience of it? A quote from the story that shows this is, to experience the world through the senses was different from simply having data about the world. The first story in this arc made me eager to read the next two. The second story heightened that in a good way. Unfortunately, I wasn't as big a fan of the last story. I'm rating it a 7 out of 10. Overall, I still liked this arc a lot, and I would give it an 8 out of 10 because of the things that I liked so much in the first two stories. That's the first three stories that are spread across the Apocalypse Triptych. If you like apocalyptic fiction, this anthology might be a nice place to start. I'll cover more story arcs from this series in other videos. Please comment below if you've read this or if you have anything you'd like to say about books and fiction in general. Bye for now.